as Brian pointed out, we're going to spend the next few hours talking about secure remote commerce. We'll start off with some of the basics of secure remote commerce when we're talking about the differences between traditional remote commerce and what we are calling secure remote commerce is really going to be the difference between the same sort of how do you get from typical transactions online to something that's a little bit more controlled in terms of how cardholders are authenticated and how they interact with merchants and other participants within the SRC ecosystem. So if we look at payment, the physical payments, as Brian pointed out, we have the chip, we have the terminal. Those things are all defined. There's a very specific way that cardholders interact. They provide the payment credential, which is represented by the black line, alongside their actual consumer interaction. They have to physically use the card with the terminal. Typical commerce online is similar, right? There's lots of advances over the last few years where this doesn't represent all online commerce today, but we basically have the idea that the consumer is interacting with the merchant, and through that interaction, they're passing to the merchant the payment information. That payment information is part of that consumer's interaction. And just like physical payments, remote payments also go right into what we call the business as usual authorization, right? The way that the merchant acquires the card information doesn't really change the way that it's authorized on the back end. If we look at secure remote commerce, the key difference for a lot of people, it makes sense, is the cardholder is interacting with the merchant. They're interacting, selecting products, they're choosing to check out. But what they're not providing the merchant is the actual payment information. That information is being provided in an alternate channel. It's being provided by the SRC system itself. So the typical transition is cardholder works with the merchant works with some sort of process for selecting the digital card. Once the card is selected, the SRC system steps in and provides the payment information, which then again is used as a BAU authorization on the back end. If we look at the objectives of secure remote commerce, we have quite a few things that we started out wanting to do. And if we look at establishing interoperable interfaces, we want to make sure that if someone's going to participate with secure remote commerce, that there's an interface that's provided, an API, an SDK, some level of commonality that ensures that if a merchant's participating with one SRC system or one SRCI, then they're going to participate in the same way. The integration model is not going to vary from a format and technology perspective from one system to the other. Also, we want to make sure that there's a consistent representation of the consumer account data. That basically means that when a consumer is moving from one merchant to the other, using one implementation of SRC from another, the look and feel is consistent. Not only is the look and feel consistent, but you have the way their card is represented is consistent. So the idea of the SRC system simply providing a PAN and an expiry date to the merchant. They're also providing digital card information that is used in the user interface. How is it presented? How does the consumer recognize their card? We also want to make sure that each transaction is protected. Through that protection, SRC offers the ability to enable what we call dynamic data. This dynamic data is just a unique value that's created for each transaction and passed to the merchant or whoever's processing their transactions. And of course, we want that to be communicated using the interoperable interfaces. We also want to make sure that there's transparency between all the participants. the cardholder authentication, what kind of device identifier is being used. The idea is that you want to make sure that the way the cardholder was authenticated is understood by all participants within the ecosystem for SRC. It allows people to make decisions. It allows people to understand the transaction and basically make decisions on how they want to process it or how they want to move forward. We also want to make sure that the integration of the use of the specification is usable with other EMV technologies. We want to make sure that EMV payment tokenization is usable. We want to make sure that EMV 3D Secure is usable. The idea behind this is these are all similar technologies. They solve different problems, and using them together is likely to produce a better outcome for the SRC ecosystem. We also want to minimize as much as possible cardholder providing the payment information. As I pointed out on the first slide, the goal is to remove the need for cardholders to provide any payment information at all. Ideally, the only thing they're providing is their consumer identity, who they are. And we want to make sure that the way that consumers are verified is the same. And within SRC, if you've seen the 0.9 public version that we put out in, I think it was October, September, I forget, there's a distinction between consumers and cardholders. The idea is consumers are the, we'll say, entity interacting with merchants. Cardholders are the entity that has a relationship with the issuer. So how do we pull those two roles of a person together into the SRC ecosystem? We want to make sure that someone being verified at the beginning of a transaction is also verified by the issuer potentially before the transaction is over. So let's look a little bit about secure commerce scope. And I'll take Brian's model and start with what's outside of the scope of SRC. We're not changing the transaction processing. Some people say that, yes, you are changing the transaction processing, and we're changing the way that merchants get information for payments. We're not changing how they actually process that. So if a merchant changes the way they receive a PAN and an expiry date, well, they're going to have to change some of their internal processes. But once that transaction goes into an authorization process, it shouldn't change, right? There should be some minor changes. Maybe there's a new type of dynamic data, but ultimately the process shouldn't change, and those who are participating don't have to change. And of course, no implementation mandates. No one is saying that everyone has to use SRC. No one's saying that everyone has to use tokenization either. So it's just straightforward. We're providing a set of tools for everyone to use. We also want to make sure that there's no restrictions on who participates within SRC. We don't want to control the merchant experience. Merchants have a variety of checkout models today. We don't intend to require any change to that. We also want to make sure that we're not providing compliance or policy requirements around the use of SRC or anything like that. So those are the things that are out of scope. What's in scope? We want to make sure that the preparation of data, the data that a merchant receives is always the same from SRC system to SRC system. We want to make sure that the way it's formatted is the same. The values obviously are going to change, but we want to make sure that the data is the same across all SRC systems. We want to make sure that the guidance and clarity of how to connect with the SRC system, this comes in with the APIs, the SDKs, so that's fairly straightforward. And of course, we want to provide guidance around the visual elements. And this goes towards the consistency, making sure that if a merchant chooses to use SRC and they also want to notify or indicate to a cardholder that they are using SRC, we can provide guidance on how we recommend they do that. So if you look at the roadmap, As everyone knows, we've been working on SRC for quite a while. I think it was maybe 2017, 2016 that we started. But it's been quite a while. We've had the core specification. We're looking to get that out as soon as possible. We're looking to have mark reproduction guidelines in the same way that the QR code has a mark. We believe that SRC should have a mark to help with consumer understanding. We were also going through third-party security reviews, making sure that we're calling it a secure remote commerce technology, so it seems reasonable that we have a third party look at the security on that. We also have a third party working on user interaction analysis. We'll cover a little bit of what they've done and where they're working on a little bit later in the slides. And then as a result of the security and user interaction, we'll have UI guidelines, API specifications, and an SDK, all defined within the specifications. Looking forward, we understand that there's a lot of complexity with SRC. What seems like a very simple concept, checking out online, actually becomes extremely complicated when you try to tie all the participants together using a single technology. Issuers, processors, payment networks, merchants, and everybody else who fits in between who provides incremental value. So we're looking at how can we help create more educational content, white papers, other guidance documents, maybe use case documents, and of course looking towards having more webinars and more online content for people to review. As far as industry engagement, here we are in Las Vegas, so this is one of the engagement sessions that we've planned. We're also looking to have in July with the US Payments Forum, we're looking to have another session similar to this there as well. And of course, trying to create more webinars for online content. So some of the things that you can look forward to as we move out of a 0.9 version that everyone has access to towards a 1.0. The contents of the annexes within 0.9 are being moved into their own documents. So the Annex A will be moved into the UI guidelines. Annex B, which was the API, both the server-to-server type APIs as well as the SDKs will be moved into separate documents as well. Security guidelines are going to remain an annex or a separate chapter within the specification. So I think with that, I'll take the first little pause section, and I know the microphones don't have electricity to zap you, but if anyone wants to test it, please do. Yeah, please with the mic. Thank you.
Sure. When you talk about the mark, I know that's a topic I get asked about a lot. Is the idea that it's some sort of indication of a secure checkout, less so than any sort of branding, or is it more about branding it a certain way?
No, I don't think it's about branding. I think what we want to provide is as SRC is a framework, and people choose to use it in whatever implementation they have. We believe that it's of value for consumers to understand that they're using that versus something else. And EMVCo doesn't create products. We don't create anything like that. So the mark is essentially available for people to identify that their implementation is used or based off of the technologies that are within the specification.
Is a good parallel or a good analogy like the SSL certificate mark on a website to show that it's a secure checkout from that aspect? I don't mean visually, I just mean like conceptually. Conceptually,
yeah. I mean, it's not necessary. Yeah, it's just an indicator that something is going on behind the scenes, and that something would be, a secure. Because if you imagine issuers are going to be providing cardholders opportunities to enroll their cards into this SRC system, and then later the cardholder is going to use it in a checkout environment. Having some visual indication between those two seemed like a critical component. Yes, Brian has a question.
I don't know if you were planning to do this at a later point in your presentation, but you've already started using a couple of abbreviations. Did you want to take a second just to let people know what's on the sheet and why. And
Sure.
I know one of my challenges when I talk about EMVCo, people will say to me, if you mean merchants, why don't you just say merchants? Why do you keep using DSA? And I don't know what the hell that means, but there is a rationale as to why we have functions and not names.
Yeah, there is a sheet, so everyone can take a look at that. Let me jump to the slide and then go over that, and then we'll come back. It's all right. That is if I left it in. I may have taken it out. Yeah. So I can just hold the copy while we look at it and just go over it real quick. Thank you, Brian. So if everyone takes a look at the paper that's on your desk, you have the SRC program, and that is, there's no good acronym for that, so it's just the SRC program, but it's effectively the component of an SRC implementation that's providing the guidance around how an implementation is intended to be functional, right? We also have SRC system. That is the component that is orchestrating all of the SRC activities. It's orchestrating the enrollment, it's orchestrating the checkout, and all the bits and pieces in between. We also have the, which is still the DSA, which is the digital shopping application. We've recently decided that we'd change the name of that because not everyone who's using SRC is always involved in a shopping scenario. But effectively, that is most likely the merchant, some sort of marketplace. We also have a DCF, which is the digital card facilitator. This is going to be the component of a user's experience where they're actually verifying who they are, choosing shipping addresses, or providing any incremental information that a merchant needs for the checkout. If that's what the merchant chooses to have. It could be a wallet, merchants and issuers, any sort of controlled part of the SRC experience where the card has already been selected. We also have the SRCI, or the SRC initiator. This is a more broad term, and it's basically someone who's working and has a relationship with merchants and provides them their SRC integration, right? So they're kind of the middle entity between a merchant or a DSA, which we call the DPA, and the SRC system. And then finally, we have the SRCPI, which are participating issuers, because we realize that there may be issuers who are not participating, right? So jump back to questions. I can't have answers if there's no questions. All right. All right, thank you, I'll move on. So I talked a little bit about the UI research, and some of the work that we wanted to do is get a global perspective on UI. I know that the members of EMVCo are globally distributed, but we felt that it was important to go through a variety of tests. We did a qualitative set of tests last year, and this year we're currently looking at quantitative tests. And all of these are basically just to see what is important about SRC to encourage consumer understanding. We want to make sure that when a consumer is going through a checkout, if there's an SRC option that's provided by the merchant, what is the best scenario for that? How should that work? It was conducted, there were basically 50 interviews that were conducted as one-to-one, sort of. We had a team of people that would interview one person. It was conducted in the US, Germany, India, and Brazil. As far as the actual roadmap itself, as I pointed out, we had a qualitative set, which is indicated in the red colors. It would round one in Chicago, and then we had a third round in an international qualitative analysis. Next is going to be the quantitative, which is more like a survey, and the idea is that there's a very large number of people participating in the survey. The final result of all this research is going to provide us what we hope is confirmation that the decisions we've made in the UI guidelines and the rest of the specification are confirmed by the research. Some of the, so basically the research is all about the consumer experience. And as we look at SRC, we have a few components that we have. Basically, the consumer experience goes through some visual elements. We have the SRC mark, which is, as we've identified, just some symbol that lets a consumer know that they're using SRC, or some implementation based off of SRC. We also have the SRC trigger. And a lot of people use the SRC trigger in context of a button. It's not necessarily always a button. It's just the thing that the consumer does to trigger the SRC experience. It's fairly straightforward. It could be visual, possibly audible. Within the specification 1.0, we're mostly concerned around the visual components of an SRC trigger, but we do enable other SRC trigger methodologies. And finally, from a consumer experience, after they've selected the trigger or initiated the SRC experience, they're going to select a card, right? The idea is that you hit a button, you trigger the experience, and the next thing you want to do is select a card for your checkout. This is going to be kind of preceded potentially by identification, right? If you have somebody who just hits a button, you don't necessarily know who they are, right? So you have to either have some information that's stored on the device they're using that lets you know who they are, or you have to ask them, right? So before you can present the cards, there will be some other steps that the consumer might go through just to make sure that their consumer identity is known and verified. After a person's selected or gained access to the cards, they're just, you know, the cards are going to be presented, and then we're going to have someone select one of the digital cards. Once the digital card is selected, they'll go into the DCF or the digital card facilitator and confirm all of the information, if shipping address, any other information that the merchant might need. At that point, the DCF might do additional cardholder authentication. And then finally, at the very end, the merchant gets all the information back from the SRC system and provides a confirmation again. You know, you, as a cardholder, selected some things using SRC. The merchant presents it and says, are you sure this is what you wanted to do? So if we talk a little bit more about the mark and the name, you know, the name is less important. I think it's the mark, the icon of SRC, which is going to be the critical visual identifier. Ideally, the mark will enable consistent, memorable experiences. Someone who is using the checkout will recognize one checkout from the other, even though it's on a different merchant, maybe provided by a different implementation. And of course, we want to make sure that the messaging around the SRC ecosystem is consistent as well. We want to make sure that the idea of security, speed, and convenience is communicated. But ultimately, it's just an icon that allows people to recognize that an implementation is based off of secure remote commerce specifications. So if we look a little bit more around the trigger, I'm not sure, yeah, I guess it's displayed pretty good on both of those. You can see that there's obviously if this, take an example of a button, right? So we take, as an example for SRC trigger, a button. There's going to be some shape to the button. What can go on the button, right? You might have the SRC icon itself. You might have the SRC display images. You might have a call to action of some kind. How can these be arranged, right? You might have a button, and this is where I think it might be a little difficult, but can you guys see, right about here, you can see the button shape. You know, what goes in the trigger? Is the icon on the trigger? Is it not on the trigger? There's a variety of different variations on how that works. We'll provide some guidance on that with the UI guidelines and possibly the reproduction guidelines for the mark itself. So if we look at the SRC, you know, we talk about consistency all the time. We want to make sure that, you know, whatever is done with an SRC, that there's always a consistent way to recognize it. That could be done with the trigger. We want to make sure that there's an identifiable way for a consumer to select that they want to choose an SRC-based experience. And based some of the feedback that we've had so far is that we want to make sure that the merchant's experience isn't changed, but at the same time give the merchants the option to be able to show that that SRC's part of their checkout experience. So if we talk more about the consumer and device assurance. This is part of the consumer's choice, right? So they've triggered the SRC experience. We have to make sure that, number one, we identify a consumer. Number two, we could do that through device identity. If we don't have a consumer identity or device identity that's known when they click the trigger or they initiate an SRC experience, then they'll have to provide that identity to themselves. But the key component is you can't simply give people access to an SRC profile unless you have some level of trust. So we want to make sure that that it's a successful recognition, and we want to make sure that the selection by the consumer is required prior. The consumer selection is preceded by the authentication of the consumer themselves. So once someone's recognized, there's a variety of levels of assurance within SRC. You have card-based assurance, cardholder-based assurance, consumer-based assurance, all used for different things. Device-based assurance is important, and of course you have something that we call like a relational assurance. If you have the use of one device and you go through some level of cardholder assurance, then you might be able to create a relationship between that cardholder and the device and be able to identify that through a historical relationship-based assurance level. But I would highlight that on the consumer side, we have it's probably the most important part about SRC to create the kind of consistency and speed. The earlier you can identify a consumer in the process, the quicker that you're able to provide them the experience that they're looking for. So using biometrics, some risk-based patterns, or you might have to step up using some sort of consumer input. For the cardholder, and this is usually going to occur within the DCF. So a cardholder selected a card, now they're in the DCF, and based off of the consumer identification that was conducted and the assurance of the consumer, the DCF may choose to go through additional cardholder verification. Again, that could be risk-based, it could be based off of 3DS, either payment or non-payment authentication. And it could enable the issuer directly to verify and authenticate the cardholder. So as we see, there's 3 steps, right, to getting access to the SRC profile. First, recognition of the consumer through the device, through the card itself, or some other event. Some level of assurance is done on the consumer. They'll then get access to the SRC profile. That SRC profile will be different for each SRC system. It will consist of a variety of cards that have been previously enrolled. But ultimately, it's just the way that SRC starts out. These 3 steps get to the point where a consumer can then select the card they want to use for checkout. So there's a variety of options, right? So if we think about the device, you could have a recognized device, but if you have multiple consumers associated with that device, you might be able to recognize the device, but you might not be able to identify the person. You might have to ask them, well, there's 2 people using this device, which one are you? And provide some assurance that you are who you say you are. So we also look at the idea of how the consumer assurance works. It does get a little complicated. If you can imagine the SRCI working with the merchant, the SRC is aggregating multiple SRC systems. So as you get to identification of a consumer, if you have to verify the consumer, well, who does it? The merchant could do it. The SRCI probably doesn't have a relationship with the consumer at all, so they can't verify a consumer. So that has to be federated across the SRC systems themselves. So an SRCI will basically take a selection from the SRC systems available, and one of those SRC systems will go through a consumer level verification. This verification then is shared across SRC systems through the SRCI once the card is selected. So then we have the candidate list, and this is basically after all the steps I just went over. Now the cardholder sees which cards are available for selection. These are all the enrolled cards that they've previously used. It's tied to the consumer identifier that they entered or that's previously known. They could have a single card selection or multiple card selection, but ultimately this is where they choose the card. And up to this point, everyone can imagine that the checkout process is linear, right? You always select the card or you enter the card, then you confirm and then you check out. But with SRC, we imagine that you can decouple these experiences. For example, if you have an app-based experience, you might select the card once and then use it repeatedly over time. So the candidate list would be appropriate for selection, but it doesn't always lead immediately to a DCF user experience. Right? It could just be that you simply selected the card for later use. But after the card is selected in a normal checkout, you'll definitely get to the point where you're in the DCF. The DCF is saying this is the card you selected, and it basically provides all the information to the cardholder that they might need to know for checkout. And part of the merchant's request for checkout might include, well, this is a physical product that I need to ship. You know, if you don't have an address, you know, ask the cardholder to enter an address. So this is where the DCF goes into more detail to interact with the cardholder rather than the consumer. So then finally, after the DCF goes through, we have transition back to the merchant's website or the DPA. And that then is where the merchant confirms all the information, all the decisions the cardholder made through the checkout process, and the consumer acknowledges that the information is correct, and then the merchant receives the payload and can continue checking out. So again, I'll pause again for questions. Yes?
Apparently going to be the only
You're
one that asked
saving me.
questions the whole time. I even had to bring my cheat sheet, so I called things the right thing. So the acronym part is hard, not just because I can read them, but in trying to think through it as you talk about it and trying to assign it to entities known in the ecosystem today, right?
Yeah.
So if I think about the last part around the digital card facilitator presenting back the selected card, I get that, but what role presented the list of available cards?
The SRCI.
Okay. And that is like an acquirer, an example of that role?
It could be. The way I think of it is it's an aggregator that says I have a merchant on one side and many SRC systems on the other. So that the SRCI is the one who says, once the cardholders initiated the SRC experience, it's the one that reaches out to each SRC system and says, do you know who this is? If you do, which cards are available for selection?
So in the construct of a checkout today with like a wallet provider, they are doing some of that today, right? They are presenting a list of available cards that have been enrolled in their ecosystem, blah, blah, blah. Does that model hold? Like, then they become that role if they chose to? Or is that a separate party? I'm trying to tease apart that, and in the existing sort of wallet checkout process today, what pieces of that get replaced by a new entity?
I don't think any specific part gets replaced. I think what it does is it says you can have a wallet, but those who participate in the wallet could be a variety, right? So the wallet, from a cardholder's perspective, once they click on that button, to them that's the wallet. What SRC is doing and what the SRCI is doing is aggregating all of the SRC systems out there to bring the information back to that one single user interface. So you could have a variety of wallets that sit on the edge or on the other side of the SRCI. You could have different types of digital wallets. You could have online wallets. The information that is presented is based off of which DCFs or wallets are available for checkout, what the merchant's acceptance is, what their requirements are for that particular transaction. The SRCI presents all those cards, and once a consumer selects a particular card, they're going to be shifted off to one of the wallets, the DCFs. It's going to be orchestrated by the SRC system itself.
So could the SRCI be the browser itself?
It could.
Okay.
It could. So, and that's one of the nice things about the framework is no one has to do any one thing. And in fact, you could have one entity performing the role of DPA, SRCI, and DCF. You know, if a merchant wanted to create a completely controlled checkout, they could take on those roles, or they could pick and choose which ones they want. Yes, question?
I had a quick question going back to probably one of the first slides, which is about the consumer experience with the button, and more work needs to be done, was what I heard, like you're working on improving that. I was wondering if you had thought about the user experience in the context of other payment methods that were being accepted at the same time. So the SRC button might pop up. Perhaps for some merchants, they have got card on file information of their own based on that consumer's participation with them in the past, or even one of the other pays. So how, you talked about consumers, cardholders being a bit confused by the one button. Did you do any testing with multiple payment concepts that might have to be incorporated together?
Yeah, so let me make sure I understand the question. If we have a merchant that has a variety of checkout options, how does SRC fit within that?
Yeah.
So we see SRC as just being just one of those options, right? A merchant can choose to have whichever methodologies they want to support. They could have payment thing 1, payment thing 2, and we see SRC just sitting amongst those options. We hope that some of those options would be replaced by SRC, like if you had a payment network-based option, and then a payment network then chose to participate with some SRC, then that option would go away for the merchant, but it would then be part of SRC.
It would take some time, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, let's face it. How long did it take for the U.S. to move to tech? Right? We don't pretend that any of this is going to happen overnight. What we're doing is we're thinking that long term, the industry needs more tools to be successful in online transactions.
So I'm seeing wallets in the DCF list in terms of participants, and I'm curious, that's kind of news to me. I don't understand how wallets would fit in there. Wouldn't that be an additional step for a user? If they're presented with they're presented with the card art for all the registered cards that are registered for SRC. So how does a wallet participate in the DCF?
Well, it could be the DCF. So you could imagine one scenario where an issuer is enrolling their cards into an SRC system.
Yeah.
That issuer might say to themselves, you know what? I want my cardholders to go to a DCF that they know. So the issuer might create their own wallet or their own DCF and put it in, when the cards are enrolled, they basically tell their cardholders, when you go through checkout, use our DCF.
So in the user flow then, would that be an additional step if you have to select that issuer's DCF? Because then if I have three cards from 3 brands enrolled, then wouldn't there be an additional step to select the DCF from that brand?
The DCF, part of the candidate list includes the option to display the DCF. So if a cardholder has enrolled a card and that card is associated with a particular DCF, that would be shown in the candidate list.
I
So the card selection itself is also the DCF selection.
Okay. All right. And then, oh no, that's it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, more questions are good, so thanks.
So the same card could be enrolled with multiple DCFs,
Potentially.
right? Okay.
Yeah, and instead of having, you know, one card with a bunch of DCFs on that, an SRCI implementation could choose to create 2 cards. They could, I mean, from an implementation perspective, you know, we've provided the UI guidance and the tool set to move the data around, but actually how the implementation works is probably we just have 2 listings of that card with 2 different DCFs. Great. Everyone's getting excited. I like it.
You're finally having questions.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so I had just some questions around the philosophy of SRC, and you know, if I look at how wallet works today in the physical world, so you have a token that is generated by a Visa, MasterCard, or Amex, and they are passed to the point of sale, you know, whether using NFC or MST with Samsung, and they are passing. So a merchant doesn't need, needs to have either an NFC terminal that is ready to accept a transaction, to read a token. It can be an MSD, or it can be an NFC EMV token. It goes. So on the web, what I don't understand is, you know, technically SRC could be generating some tokens the same way on the physical world that could be populated in existing sites. Meaning, you know, so an existing site needs, a PAN or a DPAN, and in a way could be a dynamic CVV or something like this, without the merchant having to change, you know, anything, which I think is always the problem when each time you know, there's some complex technology, you know, 3D secure or things like this. It's so complex for the merchant. It takes so much time to deploy that the adoption takes 10 years. I mean, like the adoption for NFC. I mean, it's been 20 years. I mean, finally we're getting there. And so what I wanted to understand was, you know, is there a way that SRC could be simplified so that tokens can be used on existing sites, generated without the merchant having to do some complex? And if the merchant doesn't need to do something very complex, how fast do you think merchants will be ready to accept these tokens? Because you know, if not, you know, we see a long cycle there. So.
Yeah, so it's a couple of questions in there, I think. Number one is can SRC deliver tokens? And true, I think the answer is yes, but it could be multiple. I think part of your question is can SRC provide something to a merchant that doesn't change the way they work today?
Yes.
And I think, yeah, so SRC is an option. You could return PAN, you could return a payment token. Within the SRC specification, there's other reference IDs. So you have digital card reference IDs. So depending on how the merchant, how much of their work is based off of SRC, they could receive PANs, which wouldn't require them to change anything. They could receive payment tokens, which also wouldn't really require them to change anything. But as an option, they could have some things like security tokens that are based off of SRC that the merchant could store for future transactions, like merchant-initiated transactions. I feel like I'm not hitting your question.
I mean, yes and no, because I mean, if it was that easy, I guess you would be rolling out. I mean, you would be. I mean, anyone with a wallet could be paying on an existing website with digital tokens, and that's not the case, right? It's today I'm still entering my PAN and my CVV, and you know, it seems that it's the days of doing this are still going to take some time. So
yes.
I see some great technology here. What I'm trying to see is is adoption and some kind of a takeoff. But the way I see the spec right now, I feel it's still, you know, fairly complex for ignition. I mean, it's all about ignition at this stage.
It is complex, and it will take time. There's a lot of parts of SRC that are new. Like, not every parts of the industry as a checkout system has a issuer's participation so closely tied to checkout, right? The idea that the issuer is enrolling the information into the SRC system's then sharing that with a variety of merchants, that is kind of new in some ways, that much interaction. So I think you're right. It will take quite a while for many of these things to be well understood within the industry first, and then implemented in a way that is, as you say, solves all the problems. And we don't pretend that SRC solves all the problems. We're just starting with a version that we think solves a lot of them.
But don't you think that there could be a faster way to, to provide ignition without, some of the complexities that you've designed? To have, in fact, more security on e-commerce. You could achieve more security on e-commerce without having to wait, that much for the merchants to adopt it.
I think that the specification kind of enables the complexity if someone chooses, but it could also create it in a very simple way. You could have an SRC system that doesn't have the issuer integration. The only thing it does is store cards or store pans and then returns them. So I think the complexity part of SRC isn't to try and solve online processing and checking out in the same way that it's always been done. Is to create a framework where people can have different kinds of participation, right? So with that, with the idea that things are being orchestrated, there's multiple participants, there's multiple DCFs, there's multiple DPAs. There has to be some complexity in managing all of that ecosystem. And with an SRCI sitting in the middle, it even adds more complexity. So what we've seen is that we can't just build a specification for a singular solution. We have to build a specification that enables a variety of solutions. We can't predict what those solutions are. So the spec is complicated, but I can imagine that any implementation based off the spec would likely be much simpler than the specification.
Okay. And maybe one last question.
Sure.
A lot of others, but
there's no line, so you're free.
There is?
There is? Oh,
that's good.
Sorry.
But so how do you position, I know you said that 3D Secure was part of SRC in a way, but how do you position a 3D Secure 2.0 experience within SRC, for doing commerce? technically, 3D Secure 2.0 is a more frictionless approach. Thank God, finally, after 3D Secure 1.0 was really not the best example. Great technology, but so how do you? I view that Europe seems to be going more towards SCA in a way, what they call as an initiative, and. So I'm interested to understand how you position them, and where do you see what is going to be most effective?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and I get that one a lot, which is how is 3D Secure going to work with SRC? And for version 1 of SRC, it's SRC systems and the broader ecosystem enabling participants to communicate the information necessary for 3DS. So right now, we've built an SRC specification that enables 3DS. It doesn't foresee any tighter integration. There's nothing within the specification that says when using 3DS, do this. What we have right now is just the ability to communicate the data that's necessary for 3DS. We see that in the future, on our roadmap, we might be able to identify cleaner ways of incorporating the two technologies together. And,
Okay.
Sorry, but the next question, yeah.
Thank you. So I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. In my mind, when I'm looking at, there was a slide which talked about the BAU payment, right? The BAU payment authorization flow. And what's happening is before that, So now with 3DS2 specifications that we are going through, as well as the SRC specification, so in my mind, I'm picturing there's this whole process of checkout which happens, before the BAU payments, where step 1 is selecting my payment method, and step 2 is authenticating myself as this is my payment method. And these are the two different areas that you're tackling with SRC and 3DS2. Is that a correct understanding?
Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
So 3DS is all about cardholder. SRC is about consumer. How do you identify the consumer? And you might use 3DS to verify them, but SRC is more focused on identifying the consumer and then enabling other technologies like 3DS to be used to verify them,
Right.
authenticate them.
And they can be, one can have SRC initiator and all of that enabled and not do 3DS2 as yet, or one of the other.
Yeah. So they're completely optional. There's nothing within SRC that is dependent on either tokenization
Right.
or 3DS.
So my other follow-up question, and this is my last question.
Sure.
So one of the things which I'm seeing in the flow, so on the DCF and the issuing sides, which is your participating issuer, that's the card environment, of course, and then there is the SRC initiator, right? And in between is the orchestration, which is being done by the SRC system. Now, in one of the slides you mentioned that SRC initiator will have to probably go to the SRC systems to find out where does this particular consumer's details reside,
Correct.
right? So in that sense, an SRC initiator should then have information of what all SRC systems exist.
Yes.
Okay.
So there's a process within SRC that we call onboarding, which is a SRCI is going to have to onboard to each of the SRC systems that they predict they will support. So you can imagine an SRCI has many merchants, and they say, well, I want to work with SRC systems A, B, and C, but not E and F. So
Okay.
so it's up to them to onboard to those SRC systems.
Okay. So in that sense, would there be a directory kind of a thing where the SRC initiator application, so that SRC initiator software could actually say that, these are the SRC systems which are live, and these are my selections, and then they get connected?
We don't have anything in the spec for that.
Okay.
But if it, one of the nice things about the spec is that we can issue bulletins fairly quickly. If we identify that something is needed, a registry of some kind, similar to the way that we have for tokenization, we have bin controller registration and TSP registration.
Right.
If we find that there's a need for that, I think that we can incorporate it if it's needed.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
If that's not in the spec, then how is the initiator determining what ones are available? Like where is it calling to ask, all right, I have this card number as example, like who can give me, who is the right?
So the question is how does the SRCI know which SRC
Right.
system?
Right.
I think the presumption that we have is that since everything in SRC is based off of payment cards, that the bin would be used. So when a SRC system starts up, it'll go to issuers, and issuers will enroll their cards, and those cards will have bin ranges with them. And then when SRCI is on board to the SRC system, the idea is that those bin ranges would be associated with a particular SRC system. That information could also be included as to which SRC system to talk to. Just simply for an SRCI, it could be, well, all of them that they've onboarded to. Because at that point, they don't know whether the SRC system has cards that are appropriate for that merchant, whether the merchant even accepts them. So the idea is that every SRC system that they talk to, they should, or they've been onboarded to, they should call for every transaction. But once the card is selected, that card was provided by the SRC system, so the SRCI then knows which path to take after card selection.
Yeah, I think once it's selected, the flow becomes obvious, right? But I think it's in that initial identification, even where to go. If you make the parallel of tokenization and say, yeah, every card can only go to one token provider, right? So then you know if it's a Visa bin, you're going to Visa, et cetera. Sounds like that's at least the initial working model for.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. The idea that one PAN could be associated with multiple SRC systems is probably a complexity we can't solve.
Hi. So
Hi.
piggybacking off of that,
Okay.
can you help explain how the SRC framework aligns with merchant routing choice and the debit networks in the U.S.?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
So under the Durbin Amendment in the U.S., the merchants must have routing choice. And so if one digital card aligns with one network right now, there's concerns on the merchant side that they may lose routing choice and have regulatory issues.
Okay, so I think that it is a response to that. I know it wasn't necessarily a question, but I think that the result of an SRC experience is the payload which gets returned to the merchant. The merchant will receive a PAN, they may receive a token, they may receive, well, one or the other at this point. How they choose to route that, I think, is still their decision. SRC is merely providing that information to the merchant. How they use that for authorization is still up to them. We start off with a little bit of a basic. What is checkout? We have different types of solutions today. You have merchant-provided solutions. You have different marketplaces. There's a lot of people involved. You have guest-type checkouts. You have things that are using card on file. SRC really hopes to support all of that, right? The idea is that we just want to change the way that information is delivered and how it's delivered in a more secure way. But also we want to create the specifications for that, obviously the APIs. So that those who are currently participating in a checkout continue to do what they do, just maybe using SRC as a framework and as a technology. So if we look at models of checkout, we have all of these entities. We have DPAs, which is a role, SRCI. We have different devices. Consumers are involved. There's some sort of user interface. You have the trigger itself, the SRC systems, and DCF. And you can see that when you start looking at the multiplicity of everything, it's not just one person doing one thing, which is most of what the checkout solutions are today. Somebody said, I have a good idea. Let me create a checkout solution. I'm rendering the button. When someone clicks it, I'm providing the user interface. When the user interface is displayed, they're doing everything. With SRC, we contemplate that anybody can participate in any part of that role. So while the diagram is a little complicated, what we try to show is that there are different models based off of who's involved and how they're providing the functions of SRC. So you can think of, pretty much at all times for SRC, a DPA is going to be involved. And remember, that's the merchant. That's the merchant's website specifically. It's always going to be there. You might have one SRCI, you might have multiple. For each SRCI, you might have multiple SRC systems, one SRC system. But when you start looking at whether there's a device involved, whether the card member's there or not, whether there's a UI or not, you start seeing that there's different models, and there's a lot of complexity. And with our analysis, we tried to summarize it into two basic models. We call SRC checkout versus merchant checkout. Not the best names, but ultimately the idea is that merchant checkout provides the merchants the most control over their checkout. Merchants who have existing checkout today that's successful, that works, they have, a deeply integrated experience with the cardholder. There's a visual style to it. So the merchant in that case isn't really interested in having the cardholder taken away from them during the checkout process. They want the cardholder to stay and exist and continue to move through the merchant's flow for checkout. So we provide the possibility within the specification to enable merchants to participate with SRC without changing their existing checkout model. We're thinking a lot like the big merchants, the ones who already have the established processes. Now, if we look at the other end of the spectrum of all the possibilities, we have something that we call SRC checkout. This is the most simple merchant integration. This is a merchant who says, I just want to sell things, but I don't want to be involved with the payment. I don't want to be involved with the checkout. I want somebody to just put a button on my page and they're going to handle everything. We call that SRC checkout. And I look at these two things as, a lot of times people used to say, well, SRC isn't solving anything that isn't already solved for. And mostly that's true. But what SRC does do is it gives the smaller merchants, the kind of long tail of merchants, the ability to use SRC without going through all of the complicated work that larger merchants do to create their own checkout experiences. So SRC enables the large merchants to do their own checkout, but it also enables all the small merchants, the thousands and thousands of online merchants where, I go to their website, I see something I want to buy, but as soon as I go to their checkout page, it's a disaster. They haven't done things well. I kind of feel a little weird about it. And I'm like, well, maybe I'll just go check some other merchant to see if I can find the same product. The idea is that SRC enables those smaller merchants to have a checkout process that consumers can recognize and identify with. And since the issuer enrolled the consumer into the SRC process, they have a higher level of trust. So they're less likely to abandon that merchant during checkout. So looking at the different models, we have a UI guideline document. It's not going to tell anybody they have to do something around the user interface. Merchants who have their existing processes shouldn't have to change them. Someone who's building an SRC implementation shouldn't have to follow strict guidelines, requirements on how the experience functions. As I pointed out a little bit earlier, you could change the way that the SRC flow works. You could have a card selection at one point in time and a checkout at a completely different point in time. So creating guidelines on exactly how that works becomes very problematic at a specification level. It doesn't make sense. You also might have a checkout that's being provided through a native application on a device. There's maybe is no button. Maybe the button is simply confirming pickup, right? I'm just confirming pickup, so now that's my checkout. So there's a variety of different models in the UI guidelines and how those provide recommendations and how to create that consistent user interface as part of the specification, but it's not going to be strict requirements. So if we look at the kind of drilling into SRC checkout, and we look at the roles versus the entities that are involved, you can see that for merchant checkout, SRC checkout, that we do foresee that there will be distinct roles provided by unique individuals. The merchant obviously will be providing their own DPA. That's the website that people shop at. There's going to be a separate entity, which is the SRC initiator, separate DCF, and separate SRC system. This could be broken up into another example where you have two kinds of SRCIs, right? So you might have the merchant still doing what they do, providing their web page, but you might have one SRC initiator that's providing that SRC checkout visual experience. But you might have another SRC initiator, which is actually in charge of managing the actual payment data or communicating the payment data on behalf of the merchant. So this is just highlighting that we don't see any one of these roles being provided by one person, two people. We see that there's functions that are grouped into roles, but which entities perform those functions isn't really strictly held or expected to be held within the role itself. For merchant checkout, just as an example showing that you might have role-based, very large merchant might choose to provide their own web page, they might provide their own SRC initiator, they might even be providing their own wallet. We can foresee this as well. And if we look at the types of transactions, and we go back to that complicated diagram, there was a part of it where we're saying, well, is the cardholder there or not? For most types of checkout, cardholder initiated checkouts, the cardholder's obviously there. But for merchant initiated transactions, we foresee that there's going to be an option for merchants to store something on file, whether it be a PIN, a token, or a reference ID, a SRC reference ID. They would be able to store that and reuse that for merchant-initiated transactions. And these two different types of transactions are fairly straightforward. Cardholder has to be present for a cardholder-initiated transaction. So that was a quick section, but it's a lot of information in there. Mostly what I was trying to get across is, the roles aren't fixed. People can perform the different functions to create different user experiences, and there's two primary models that we see right now, merchant checkout and SRC checkout. But as you can see, there's a broad spectrum and a lot of gray area between the two of those. So just pause for questions. No one's excited about merchant checkout and SRC checkout.
How do you see this working with W3C?
It's a great question. So we have recently started a relationship with W3C and FIDO. We're working to collaborate with them. Right now, we haven't really started a lot of the work, but the idea is to start answering questions like that. How do these things work together? Could a SRCI be, fulfilled by some component of W3C? I'm not an expert on W3C, so I'm kind of making that up.
Yeah.
But the idea is that we don't necessarily have those answers, but we believe that the work that we would do with them would help answer those questions.
Okay.
Okay? So if we look at the environments, and this is more, looking at the specification itself. If everyone's looked through point 9, it's a fairly large document, fairly complicated, but it's broken up into different logical components. One is, the acceptance environment, the orchestration environment, and then the card environment. And this is just a complicated diagram to try and show everybody that it is complicated. But the key thing here is that we see, for example, tokenization playing a role. We see 3DS playing a role. And some of those functions will exist in the payment environment. It's separate from the acceptance and orchestration and card environment, but the idea is that that payment environment is not in scope for SRC. What we want to do is try and work with the payment before it ever gets to a payment environment, before it ever goes into an authorization channel. We want to make sure that the information that's communicated from the issuer to the merchant before the payment happens, that's what SRC is in scope for. And if we just look at this diagram, a few people ask questions around how some of the things work. Obviously, within the acceptance environment, we have the DPA, the merchant. We have the SRCI, which could be supporting the merchant. The SRCI is connecting everything for the SRC system within the orchestration environment. Within the orchestration environment, you might have an association with the 3DS server or token requester. Those would be in scope for SRC. If we're working with those different technologies, it makes sense that they're not always part of the payment environment. Token requesters can request tokens when there is no payment involved at all. And then the issuers are always connecting into the SRC system for enrollment. Cards are enrolled by issuers, and you can see that the cardholder interacting with the issuer kind of triggers that enrollment process. And then the wallet side of this is also in the card environment. And there's a lot of things the DCF can do. We talked so far mostly around how it provides the user experience for checkout, but it also could be providing the access to the actual payment information. Some regions around the world, it's not allowed to store payment credentials. So if that part of the world is going to use SRC, then maybe the digital card facilitator actually physically is located someplace where they store the data in an appropriate way, but then is only, it's only provided to the SRC system or anybody else within SRC when it's needed. But you'll notice that there's a difference between the dotted lines between everything and the solid lines. And this is just highlighting fairly at a high level that there's different levels of communication. SRC will be providing APIs and the integration options for those which represent the solid lines. Checkout request, payload request, is the consumer recognized? These are all specified within the specification. There would be some proprietary messages. The way an SRCI talks to a DPA doesn't have to follow anything other than that SRCI's model, right? They have the relationship with the merchant. If they choose to use a proprietary interface, they can. The way that the issuer communicates information to digital cards for the use case I provided earlier, they could use a proprietary interface. The idea here is showing that while SRC is providing the APIs and the SDKs, there are situations where it's more appropriate maybe for some proprietary communication to occur. And then the green lines are all other technologies, whether that's 3DS or tokenization. So kind of digging into these different environments, we have the acceptance. Of course, this is just a different view. We have the DPA. The key thing here is that we're trying to show the orchestration component is kind of tying everything together. You can have multiple orchestration environments, but it does get complicated. It does get complicated to wrap your head around how all of this is organized. And when you're reading through the actual specification, just to keep in mind that things are kind of logically organized in this way can help interpret a lot of the information. So as an overview, and again, structure of the documentation, we have a consumer access point. And I'm just going to jump back to a slide real quick. The consumer access point is going to sit on the DPA, right? The idea is that the DPA is running on a consumer device, and we call that consumer device the consumer access point. That is going to be, well, I'll cover it there. Sorry, I'm going to jump back to the slide I was on. So slide 34 here. So we have the consumer access point, which is kind of the primary consumer integration point. We also have the environments, which I've already covered. We have events, and each event might be associated with a process, and each process may have a message associated with it, and that message would be kind of realized through an API or communication on within an SDK. And then the specification also includes the data dictionary, which is all the data that can be communicated using the messages. And of course, sitting a little bit outside of all that is the SRC program. If you look at the different data, you look at the different messages, some things are optional, some things are conditional, some things are required. At a framework specification level, we've tried to minimize the number of required elements, right? We don't want to require too many things. The SRC program is really put in place to say things that are optional for any one implementation. Well, what are the situations? When is it optional? When is it conditional? So the SRC program kind of sits on the side, managing things like onboarding. How does an SRC onboard to an SRC system? How does the issuer onboard? Looking at also, making sure that the assurance methods that are occurring, whether this SRC program wants to use 3DS in some environments or wants to use some other authentication method in other situations. Of course, ongoing operation and maintenance of the SRC system, and lifecycle management of the profile. The profile is the one thing that kind of ties the identification of a consumer to their enrolled cards. The idea that the SRC system has to keep track of everything that cardholder has enrolled through the issuers, which devices are associated with that, how are those devices associated, what level of assurance occurred when that device was associated, how many devices. So the profile is this kind of like package that represents the cardholder, the consumer, and everything that they may do within the SRC ecosystem. The SRC program might have additional requirements around security. The specification defines what we think is the level of security that's appropriate. You might have some SRC programs that change that or modify that. So looking at the consumer access point just a little bit more, it's broken down into the idea that it's the device itself, it's the software running on it. The consumer access point, number one, represents the DPA, which is the website. You'll also have the system software. This software is provided by each SRC system. It's going to be part of the consumer access point running on the device. There'll be common software, which is provided by the SRC initiator. So the SRC initiator common software is rendering the button. It's presenting the candidate list. The system software is identifying the consumer. It's identifying the device. So all of these things that are occurring on the consumer's device, we've basically put under consumer access point. So looking at the events, there's different types of events within SRC. There's participant setup events. And again, this is having a onboarding event, a registration event, how are merchants registering with SRCIs, how are SRCIs registering those merchants with the SRC systems. So these different events can occur. You have obviously, probably in my opinion, one of the most important events is enrollment. An SRC system with no enrolled cards is not very effective. There's binding events. The idea that once a card is enrolled, it can be bound to different things. It can be bound to different devices. It can be bound to different DCFs. It can be bound to different consumer identities. So these binding events start creating that SRC profile. And then there's recognition events. These occur, when a cardholder goes to a merchant website. The recognition of the device, the recognition of the consumer starts to occur. And whether that recognition results in, yes, as an SRC system, using my SRC system software, I recognize this person, or it results in a, hey, I have no idea who's on the website. It's part of the recognition events. We also have the checkout events. These are the ones that we talk about mostly. Requesting card data, receiving card data effectively. So each of these events is broken down into different processes. The participant setup, as I mentioned, is onboarding, registration, and configuration. Configuration is just managing each of the onboarding and registration over time. Merchants who accept 5 cards might soon accept 6, right? They might accept different payment things altogether. Enrollment is just one process associated with enrollment, and it does have a message. We have binding. Binding can occur, as I pointed out, it's the tying of the SRC profile to a device or a consumer identity, whatever kind of situation is appropriate for creating an SRC profile. And then within recognition, we have identity collection, the actual recognition itself as an event, as a process, and then DCF discovery. The actual messages are a little more straightforward. There's device and consumer messages. And again, these are categories. For checkout, we have 3 processes: payment collection, payload delivery, and confirmation. And the messages associated with that are checkout, payment, payload, and confirmation. The data within the SRC process, or within the SRC specification, is at this point, it's a data dictionary. It's kind of a listing of all the data that we believe is associated or useful in an SRC ecosystem. On top of all of that, we have the reference identifiers. And the complexity of SRC is managed by being able to know what everything is. There will be a reference identifier for devices, for payment cards, reference identifiers for digital cards. It's just part of the data is being able to refer to something. It's a reference to whatever the data element is in an SRC profile. And of course, then there's data associated with onboarding registration. Onboarding information might include, or registration might include, well, what kind of payment methods are accepted at a particular merchant? Do you ship digital, or do you send digital goods, or do you ship physical products? These would inform the DCF on whether they need to collect address information, and it would inform an SRCI on whether or not it needs to even talk to some SRC systems if that SRC system's enrolled cards weren't accepted at the merchant. Some of the other data that's associated, of course, we have the digital payment application data. We have event request data. These event requests are back up to, depending on what the event is. So these are logical categories for the data. It's not necessarily the way the data is organized at an object level. So this is just a kind of a high-level business perspective on the data itself with descriptions. So when a card is enrolled, all the data is sent into the SRC system. Effectively, what's created is an SRC profile. Once a PAN is enrolled, there's a profile established. You can create a digital card once you have a DCF involved. You also have issuer preferences. What kind of assurance is appropriate with this particular card? Whether or not the issuer wants to perform tokenization for the PAN is part of the enrollment event. The binding event, as I've pointed out already, is the verification. It's the idea that I'm going to link 2 things together. I'm going to link a PAN to a device ID, or a consumer ID to a DCF ID. Linking all these things together creates an SRC profile. And the binding is the establishment of that profile and the management of that profile. And you can imagine that, when a consumer clicks on a button, the SRC trigger, the SRC systems have to examine all of this information, right? So it might get the device ID, and then based off of that device ID, it'll know who the consumer is potentially. And based off of that, it'll know which cards are enrolled or which DCFs are available on that device. But the binding event establishes that and maintains it over time. It's creating that relationship mapping for the checkout. And ideally, the binding results are optimal for the cardholder, right? Using this particular device with this particular merchant, there's less friction, right? Because the more you know about the SRC profile and what's been bound and what the assurance was at the time it was bound, enables you to reduce friction. So if we look at the different recognition events, and again, this is happening right before you're going to present the candidate list. You have to recognize the DSA preferences and configurations are important. We want to make sure that If you're trying to identify a person, select which DCF is appropriate for the checkout, you'll want to make sure that you have all the DSA's preferences in place. Consumer choice is critical, right? You might have a consumer who actively says, yes, I want to do one thing versus another. So knowing what the consumer choice is important at the time of recognition, what device preferences. You know, I use my phone all the time. My preference is yes, when I'm using this device, remember it, and every time I use it, you have a little bit more trust in who I am. Or I might be using someone else's phone, and I say, don't remember this device. So there's consumer preferences that need to be considered as well. And then finally, issuer preferences. And I think this is one of the parts that's new for SRC is bringing the issuer closer into the checkout to say, well, what are my preferences during checkout? How can the issuer participate in optimizing checkout? So there's preferences that the issuer can have as well. All this results in which cards are presented in the candidate list and which DCFs or which wallets are appropriate for any particular checkout. And that's Q&A time. I'm hoping there's more questions on that one. No? Everyone's tired? All right. Okay. So the APIs. The APIs are in the annex of point 9. And as I mentioned earlier, they're going to be pulled out into separate documents. Primarily, we're doing that just to ensure that we have a more manageable set of documents over time. We believe the APIs should be kind of managed and revisioned separately from the core specification. But the actual APIs themselves, they're going to be broken down into obviously server-based APIs using two-way communication. There'll also be SDKs, which is all based off of the device itself. Everything's running on the device. How does common software talk to system software? Or how does the system software talk back to the SRC system? That level of SDK, that's the level for SDKs. They're not really intended to provide solutions for everything, right? As we revision the spec, as we revision the APIs, as people come up with new use cases, obviously, we'll have different revisions of the APIs. Some of the principles around the APIs, point 9's version has changed a little bit. There's currently a EMVCo internal review for TAs, which is ending here soon. We're doing an internal review within EMVCo for 0.95 of the specification. But some of the principles that we had is designed to be a remote procedural call style. It should be RESTful. We're trying to get it as RESTful as possible. There's experts in the APIs working on that. The SDKs are, I think, the initial SDK, I guess you could say, is web-based, JavaScript. Each endpoint of the API specifies the HTTP method used for the required operation. What is it? Is it a post? Is it a GET? The idea is that it's a resource-based API rather than a functional-based API. The API is going to be based off of UTF-8. I think that should be fine. I don't know if anyone's going to be using bizarre character sets for checkout. We haven't had any feedback that we need the larger, but it should be fine. And of course, versioning. This is probably, in my opinion, going to be the most difficult thing, right? Because with any API that's, covers so many different things and can be used in so many different ways, anytime it's changed, there's a risk to changing APIs if it's not managed properly. So versioning of the API, we're trying to find the best industry standards. What are the practices that have been successful? And we're going to try and model that based off of others' success. And the data dictionary itself at an API level would be slightly different than the data dictionary in the core document. It's going to be object-based. The objects will have individual attributes, and some of the values for each of the data elements would be based off of a finite discrete set of enumerations. The data dictionary is basically broken down on what is the data element, is it required, is it conditional, is it optional, and then finally a description. The actual structure is, again, it's a little bit more resource-based or object-based. You know, it's going to have card, you'll have enrollment processes for services. But the idea is that the API services are associated with the data, right? So you have card data, which then you have operations on the card data. You can enroll it, you can delete, you can add billing addresses. We also have messages for checkout. Of course, in the API, we have the SRC profile, and then we have the identity. And the identity is all about the recognition, making sure that when a DPA is rendering its merchant experience, it can begin doing identity lookup. So the SRCI common software can be executing in the background, talking to the system software, finding out if the consumer is known. And if the consumer is known and they're trusted, you know, in the background, this information can start flowing into the SRCI, so that when the cardholder finally clicks that button, there's not a big roundabout about all these communication and exchange of data. It's a little more instantaneous. We want to avoid having the APIs and the SDKs bog down the transaction. We're trying to ensure that the transactions are optimized by creating different points in time where the APIs can be used to create an SRC experience. All right, and then we have the federated identity. This is the one that I think the more people get familiar with SRC, this is the one that confuses the people the most. And if you think about it, it's a big challenge. No one entity within SRC owns the relationship with a consumer. Issuers will have, a consumer might have 5 issuers they have relationships with. They might have relationships with different wallets. They might have relationships with different merchants. Who's going to identify the consumer? Well, potentially the issuers can, the SRC systems can. So there has to be some way of federating that or orchestrating the identity of a consumer. And the API, in more ways than the core specification, goes into the details of how that identity is federated. I'm not a JWT, or I'm not an expert on that stuff, or OpenID expert. So I think that the idea is that we're reusing standard industry technology and other proven methods to federate the identity and federate, I think more importantly, the trust, right? The idea that just because person X verified that someone is who they say they are, do I necessarily trust that, right? There is no single authority within an SRC ecosystem that everyone can trust. You have to not only federate the verification and identification of somebody, you also have to kind of trust everybody. And that's why the beginning of SRC is consumer-based, whereas once you get into the DCF, now you get to the cardholder level. You start having relationships with issuers where issuers can make decisions on whether or not that federated identity is strong enough to avoid cardholder authentication. So there's 2 levels of identity, but the APIs are pretty good at describing how the federated identity works. And then finally, we have our security analysis. I just wanted to highlight on this real quick. Basically, it's being done by an independent third party. It's based off of the most recent draft version, which is 0.95. The objective is for the folks doing the research and doing the analysis to identify if the security is strong enough. You know, what kind of what version of TLS, what type of cryptography is being used, which version, is it RSA, is it elliptical curve? So they're looking at all these things and saying, well, for the long term, what is the right path versus what's good enough for right now? We expect to have those results soon. And as soon as we have those results, if we've made any bad decisions as a working group within EMVCo, the security analysis should give us some feedback on the decisions that we've made. So now it's really time for questions. So I've gone through all the material that I have. We still have time. We have about another, 30 minutes or so? 35 minutes?
So you may have sort of answered it, but with the digital identity piece and trust, I think one of the things I was going to ask was how do you ensure that do all parties have equal trust, right? Because I think if you look at FIDO and some of the stuff it's tried to do, part of the point is giving some idea of the level of verification so individuals can judge whether that was good enough or not. But it sounded like that element sort of exists in where like an issuer can choose whether or not they want to provide additional or require additional authentication based on the provider of the initial authentication.
That's right, and that's
Okay.
the transparency component is, the way the consumer was identified, the way they were identified and then verified needs to be transparent throughout the entire process so that at different stages people can make an evaluation of risk and say, well, I don't want to increase friction, but I want to make sure this person is who they say they are. So providing that data. Within SRC, there's the assurance section, which talks about different assurance methods. We're looking at standardizing or specifying different categories of assurance methods. And that way, basically, we can have, for each transaction, each experience within SRC, you have everybody able to know who verified the cardholder, who verified the consumer, and package all that up so that each stage, that information can be communicated. So as you point out, a DCF could say, well, I don't really trust the way that consumer was verified, so I'm gonna do a little bit more work while the consumer's in the DCF to make sure that they are who they say they are.
And is that where you look to potentially use some of the learnings from FIDO as part of that partnership?
Exactly, and I wish I had like all of that sorted out, but we're just getting started.
Sure.
Yeah.
The second question I had, and then I'll sit down and be quiet, but the APIs. So I know with the build out of the EMVCo spec for tokenization initially, I was at an issuer at the time. Part of the challenge was each of the card networks implemented that slightly differently. So you have the spec, but then what data goes in what field can sometimes vary. Are there any lessons learned from that? Is the expectation that the spec is now tight enough to where we can't expect elements in the same fields, or is it still somewhat open to exactly how data gets put into that construct?
Yeah, so I think the idea is that we will have a very specific set of APIs. It's not like in tokenization, as you point out. It's just a section titled token request and then a table with data.
Right.
There's no format, there's no protocol, there's no security on it. Within SRC, you will see, like traditional APIs for communication. Yep.
I'll make one comment. The
Yep.
challenge, I think, in some of this is the vagueness of it. As EMVCo, you have to create it in a way that leaves lots of room for how it gets implemented, right?
Yep.
So the genericizing roles, the thinking about things without actually saying like, no, this is Google in this equation, right? Or PayPal or whoever, makes it really hard to sort of wrap your head around an actual implementation of it. And I think that's the challenge in sitting here and trying to interpret all this
Yeah.
information, even know where to start, is you're trying to fit these things into existing sort of structure that you know of today, and then use that as the basis of trying to project, all right, well, what does that look like in the future? But
Yeah.
just that's part of the challenge in the real-time feedback.
Thank you. Thank you. It's one of our biggest challenges. All right. Well, I'll hang out. Maybe you guys can ask questions individually. But other than that, I think maybe we're good. So thank you everyone for coming today. I appreciate it. And for the questions that we had, thank you for those as well. Thank you.